A History of Oppression, the Rohingya Before 1978. The Rohingya people have called the Rakhine State of Myanmar home for generations, their presence deeply intertwined with the region's history and culture. They are a predominantly Muslim minority in a country dominated by Buddhism, which has often led to religious and cultural tensions. Despite their deep roots, the Rohingya have long faced systematic discrimination and persecution at the hands of the Myanmar government, which has sought to marginalize them. Before the 1970s, tensions simmered between the Rohingya and the ruling government, with sporadic outbreaks of violence and unrest. They faced severe restrictions on their movement, limited access to education and health care, and were excluded from political participation, which further entrenched their marginalization. The Rohingya were viewed as outsiders in their own country, a sentiment that would tragically escalate in the coming decades, leading to widespread violence and displacement. Historical evidence points to a long-standing Rohingya presence in Rakhine State, dating back centuries, with records indicating their contributions to the region's development. Their language, culture, and traditions are distinct and reflect their unique identity, which has been preserved despite the challenges they have faced. However, the Myanmar government has consistently refused to recognize the Rohingya as one of the country's ethnic groups, labeling them as illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, despite historical evidence to the contrary. This denial of their identity and history has formed the bedrock of the persecution they have endured, fueling a cycle of discrimination and violence. Despite living peacefully alongside their Buddhist neighbors for generations, the seeds of division were sown by the government's discriminatory policies, which sought to drive a wedge between the communities. The Rohingya, once integrated into the fabric of Rakhine State, were being systematically marginalized and stripped of their rights, setting the stage for the tragedy that would unfold in the years to come, leading to one of the most severe humanitarian crises of our time. In 1978, the Myanmar military junta, under the banner of Operation Nagamin, launched a brutal crackdown on the Rohingya population. This operation was a calculated and systematic effort to target the Rohingya, a Muslim minority group in the predominantly Buddhist nation of Myanmar. This operation, officially aimed at registering citizens, quickly escalated into a campaign of terror and violence against innocent civilians. The registration process was a facade, masking the true intent of the military, which was to instill fear and chaos among the Rohingya. Rohingya villages were raided and burned, men were arbitrarily detained and tortured, and women were subjected to unspeakable horrors. The brutality was indiscriminate, affecting the young and old alike, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. The military's objective was clear: to drive the Rohingya out of their homes and across the border into Bangladesh. This forced displacement was not just a byproduct of the violence, but a deliberate strategy to cleanse the region of its Rohingya population. Faced with the barbarity of the Myanmar military, an estimated 200,000 Rohingya fled for their lives, seeking refuge in neighboring Bangladesh. The exodus was one of the largest forced migrations in the region's history, a desperate bid for survival. This marked the beginning of a recurring pattern of displacement and suffering that would characterize the Rohingya crisis for decades to come. Each wave of violence and persecution would push more Rohingya across the border, perpetuating a cycle of misery. The journey to Bangladesh was fraught with peril. Families were forced to walk for days, often without food or water, carrying their meager belongings and their terrified children. The harsh conditions of the journey took a severe toll on the already traumatized refugees. Many perished along the way, succumbing to exhaustion, hunger, or disease. The path to safety was littered with the bodies of those who could not endure the grueling trek. Those who survived the arduous journey arrived in Bangladesh traumatized and destitute. They carried with them the scars of their ordeal, both physical and emotional, as they sought refuge in a foreign land. The Bangladeshi government, already grappling with its own challenges, struggled to cope with the influx of refugees. The sudden arrival of such a large number of people strained the country's resources and infrastructure. Makeshift camps, hastily erected to accommodate the displaced Rohingya, were overcrowded and lacked basic sanitation. The living conditions in these camps were dire, with limited access to clean water and medical care. Diseases spread rapidly, claiming the lives of many, especially children. The lack of proper healthcare facilities exacerbated the crisis, turning the camps into breeding grounds for illness. The world, largely unaware of the plight of the Rohingya, remained silent as a humanitarian disaster unfolded. The international community's inaction allowed the suffering to continue, with little hope for a resolution in sight. In 1982, the Myanmar government enacted a citizenship law that dealt a devastating blow to the Rohingya people. This law effectively rendered them stateless in their own country. The law established 3 tiers of citizenship: full, associate, and naturalized. To qualify for full citizenship, individuals had to prove that their ancestors had lived in Myanmar before 1948. However, the Rohingya, who had long faced discrimination and were excluded from official records, were unable to meet this requirement. As a result, the vast majority of Rohingya were denied citizenship, stripping them of their fundamental rights. The 1982 Citizenship Law had far-reaching consequences for the Rohingya. It denied them access to education, healthcare, and employment opportunities. They were restricted from traveling within the country and were subjected to arbitrary arrests and detention. The Rohingya were, in essence, prisoners in their own land. This act of legislative discrimination cemented their status as one of the most persecuted minorities in the world. It denied them a voice, a future, and a sense of belonging. The Rohingya were relegated to the fringes of society, their lives governed by fear and uncertainty. The international community, while expressing concern over the discriminatory nature of the law, failed to take concrete action to address the plight of the Rohingya. Section 4. Further Persecution and Displacement, 1991 to 1992. The 1990s brought no respite for the Rohingya. The decade was marked by continuous suffering and relentless persecution. In 1991 to 92, the Myanmar military launched another brutal crackdown, driving an estimated 250,000 Rohingya across the border into Bangladesh. This mass exodus was one of the largest forced migrations in the region's history. This new wave of violence was characterized by extrajudicial killings, rape, torture, and the destruction of homes and villages. The brutality was unimaginable, leaving deep scars on the survivors. The military junta, determined to solidify its grip on power and eliminate any perceived threats, targeted the Rohingya with renewed ferocity. Their aim was clear: to erase the Rohingya presence from Myanmar. The Rohingya, already living in a state of fear and uncertainty, were once again forced to flee their homes, seeking safety in a foreign land. Families were torn apart and communities were shattered. The journey to Bangladesh was perilous, marked by hunger, disease, and the constant threat of violence. Many traveled on foot for days, with little to no food or water. Many did not survive the journey, their bodies left behind in the forests or washed ashore on the banks of the Naf River that separates the two countries. The loss of life was staggering, and the survivors carried the trauma with them. The refugee camps in Bangladesh, already struggling to cope with the previous influx of Rohingya, were overwhelmed by the sheer number of new arrivals. The camps quickly became overcrowded, and resources were stretched thin. Conditions in the camps were dire, with inadequate shelter, food, and sanitation. The lack of basic necessities led to the spread of diseases, further exacerbating the suffering of the refugees. The international community, while expressing concern over the situation, failed to provide adequate assistance to alleviate the suffering of the Rohingya. Promises of aid were made, but the response was slow and insufficient. The Myanmar government, meanwhile, denied any wrongdoing and refused to take responsibility for the crisis. They continued to propagate the narrative that the Rohingya were illegal immigrants, further justifying their actions. The Rohingya, caught in a web of persecution and indifference, were left to fend for themselves. Their struggle for survival became a daily battle, with little hope for a better future. Section 5. Simmering tensions and erupting violence. The 2000s. The early 2000s witnessed a period of relative calm in Rakhine State, but tensions continued to simmer beneath the surface. The Rohingya, denied citizenship and basic rights, remained marginalized and vulnerable. Their movements were restricted, their access to education and healthcare limited, and their economic opportunities severely curtailed. The Myanmar government, while relaxing some restrictions, maintained its discriminatory policies, fueling resentment and distrust between the Rohingya and the Buddhist population. In 2009, A series of incidents involving Rohingya men and Buddhist women sparked communal violence in Rakhine State. These isolated incidents, fueled by rumors and inflammatory rhetoric, quickly escalated into widespread riots. Mobs, armed with machetes and sticks, attacked Rohingya neighborhoods, burning homes and businesses. The Rohingya, caught off guard and outnumbered, were easy targets. The violence left dozens dead and thousands displaced. The Myanmar government, instead of quelling the violence, often stood by or even participated in the attacks. Security forces were accused of siding with the Buddhist mobs, firing on Rohingya civilians, and arresting those who tried to defend themselves. The 2009 violence marked a turning point in the Rohingya crisis. It shattered the fragile peace that had existed and deepened the divide between the Rohingya and the Buddhist population.